Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of my Student Life Tips series in collaboration with EVOLVERE Mental Health. For this month's video, we're going to be talking about some tips that I had to learn the hard way relating to being a student. I'm going to share some of these with you today so that hopefully it'll make the process easier for you moving forward. The first thing that I want to say, and it's not so much a tip, but just something to be aware of, is that being a first-generation student makes everything harder in ways that you may not even anticipate. I was the first in my family to go into healthcare and to medical school, and there are a lot of things relating to medicine that I just had no idea about, sometimes until it was too late. For example, I didn't know that there are so many prep materials and resources available to study for the US medical licensing exams, also known as the STEPS. Step 1, which is generally taken after your first 2 years of medical school. There are so many expensive resources out there that people would often use to study throughout their second year of med school, and I didn't know that a lot of them existed until halfway through, and then I had to kind of play catch up. But that's just one of many examples of times when being the first person to go into medicine may have hurt me in ways that I didn't even know about until much later on. Tip number 2 is that there is no one right way to study. Maybe in high school, the way that you studied was the way that you studied and you did it for every single class and it worked for you. But then for me, at least, when I got to college, I learned that I had to adjust how I studied depending on the subject material. As the material gets more difficult and more complicated, you have to learn new strategies and ways of grappling with it. And so that's something that I encourage you to be flexible about early on in your learning journey, your learning career, so that you have the adaptability to learn how to learn no matter what the subject is. Tip number 3 relates to taking on new commitments or projects. There are a couple of common pieces of advice that you might hear related to this. The first is only do things that you're excited about and that you want to do. Don't do things because you think they'll look good for an application, because that almost always backfires. Thankfully, I didn't have too much of this issue because there were a lot of things that I was interested in and I generally followed my interests. Another piece of advice that you might hear, especially for people who are in their training or early in their career, is to try and say yes to a lot of things, because you never know what can open doors for you in the future. For me, actually, though, I ran into kind of the opposite problem, and this is something that I'm still struggling with to this day. I tend to be the kind of person who becomes overcommitted and I say yes to too many things because I have a lot of interests. I can only do multiple things at once for so long, and it's easy to become tired out with time. And I want to make sure that I do things that are not only energizing for me, but that are actually sustainable in the long term. And so one piece of advice that I would still give myself today, but that I encourage others who have a similar problem to me to consider, is to take a moment and pause before you say yes to a new commitment. This just gives you some time to think about it, figure out if it's something that's even going to fit into your busy schedule, or if it's something that you're actually really excited about doing for the long term, or if it's more something that you might get excited about in the beginning, get started, and then realize that maybe you're in over your head, or it's much longer than you expected it to take. That's something that's worth thinking about anytime you are considering jumping into a new project. Tip number 4, just because you've done well at something before doesn't mean you'll continue to do well at it. I have 2 main examples of this. The first is math. In high school, I was really good at math. I took pretty much all of the calculus and statistics classes that were available at my high school at the time, and I always did really well in them and found that things came pretty easily to me. Then when I got to my freshman year of college, my first math class, I ended up getting a C in my first semester, and that was the first time I'd ever gotten anything that wasn't an A, and it was surprising to me because, I felt like I was able to work through things normally on my own, but then college math, somehow it was a different approach. The material was much faster paced. It took some getting used to. And so that was the first time for me that I was like, just because I'm good at something now doesn't mean that I'll always be good at it later. And so I can't let myself slack off, basically. My second example, I think, goes in the opposite direction, but it further reinforced this idea for me. In college, I took a human anatomy class, and I really like anatomy, but in college I was really bad at it. And that was another class that I got a C in. And so when I got to medical school, I was really worried tackling anatomy, thinking I did so badly in this before. How am I going to get better at this? Anatomy is really important for medical school. And so I worked really hard and spent extra time studying and practicing and learning, and anatomy was easily my best subject in the preclinical years of medical school. I did really well on all of the assessments. That really reinforced for me the idea that, just because you do well in something doesn't mean you'll continue to do well in it, but also that even if you did badly in something before, there's always a second chance. You can always pick things back up, try some new strategies, figure out a different way to tackle the material, and do better. Tip number 5, grades are not everything, and failure does not define you. If anything, you should learn to expect failure, to prepare for failure, to be okay with failure, but to learn from it too. There are a lot of people who go into college or into higher education having done really well throughout their early years in their primary and secondary education, and then they get into college and they get a bad grade on a test for the first time and don't really know how to bounce back from that. You're going to make a lot of mistakes as you go through your training, especially if you're going into medicine. We make so many mistakes as we learn to become doctors, and as we learn to become better doctors, and as we go into the specialty of our choosing. Making mistakes is part of the game. Keeping that in mind, I think, can be helpful as you go through your training, because you're gonna fail a lot, but it's part of the process. And that's it. Those are some tips about being a student that I had to learn the hard way. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in next month's video.